Okay, it's just gone 2, so I think we'll make a start. Welcome everybody. As Marie said, this is the third in the fourth of the webinar series. And this time I'm going to be talking particularly about cachexia. So the aims of the session are to think about what is cachexia and why should we be concerned about it, to think about the impact of anorexia in cachexia, to look at the physical and psychosocial effects of cachexia, and also to think about what is our role in the management of patients with cachexia. And this will also lead very nicely onto the final webinar, when we will be looking at practical ways of supporting people who have difficulty with eating and drinking. So here's a couple of, coming up are a couple of definitions really of cachexia. So cachexia in any disease refers to a state of severely and pathologically low weight, and it's due principally to the loss of mass of tissues other than fat. So usually in a healthy individual, if you're trying to lose weight, for example, the first thing that your body will use up is any circulating sugar. And then it will default to using the fat stores in the body in order to provide enough energy. The difference in cachexia is that the body uses other tissues and it uses protein, muscle mass. So that is quite a significant difference in weight loss in cachexia. As you can see, it's a serious and unrecognised consequence in cancer, but cachexia is also a hallmark of other diseases, including COPD. And I think that's something that we often forget. Certainly something I used to forget, that actually cachexia occurs in diseases other than cancer. So what is cachexia? So this is quite a long definition. This is from a really good statement by Fearon et al. In 2011. So it's described as a multifactorial symptom, and I think that's quite important actually. It's a multifactorial syndrome. It's characterized by an ongoing loss of skeletal muscle mass with or without the loss of fat. So think about the muscles and think about the people that you see, that cannot be fully reversed by conventional nutritional support. And it's progressive. It provides progressive functional impairment. The pathophysiology is characterized by negative protein and energy balance, and that's due to reduced food intake and abnormal metabolism. So the two key things there are the reduced food intake, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, and abnormal metabolism. Okay. And the prevalence of cachexia is quite high. So between 50 to 80% of people with advanced cancer have cachexia, and about 20 to 40% of people with COPD have cachexia. So as you can see, the prevalence is high, and particularly high in cancer. So what does cachexia look like? And starting off really with the definition of the word cachexia, it's a very unfamiliar word, and it's a word that I actually don't use with patients all that often, because it just sounds very unusual. People don't understand what it means. But it has a Greek root, and it comes from the word kakos, meaning bad, and hexos, meaning habit, appearance, or condition. So kakos and hexos. And cachexia has been known for centuries and was actually described by Hippocrates, who said, "The shoulders, clavicles, chest, and thighs melt away," which I think is a very, very good description of what you're actually seeing in cachexia. And this is what we see. And those of you who have looked after people with cachexia will be very familiar with this appearance. And what I particularly notice is the wasting. If you look at the arms, how thin and wasted the arms are. And that's particularly because of that loss of protein, of muscle mass. I just wanted to go through a few terms. Sorry, I have to make sure that I roll this mouse the right way. So there's a few terms that I just want to define. So anorexia is a word that we use a lot when we're talking about cachexia, but it isn't only about cachexia. Anorexia is a generalized loss of appetite and a diminished intake. It is prevalent in cachexia. So anorexia is a general term, but it is very important in cachexia. I've also just put in a definition of malnutrition. And we did talk about malnutrition in an earlier webinar. I think the difference with malnutrition is that it can be treated and reversed using nutritional therapies, whereas cachexia and the weight loss associated with cachexia is much more difficult to treat. Weight loss, as we remember from a previous webinar, can be voluntary or involuntary, and in this case we're often looking at involuntary weight loss. And cachexia is characterised by involuntary weight loss that is difficult to reverse. So I just wanted to go through those terms, just so that there's some clarity. So Firo et al. Have described 3 stages of cachexia that I've illustrated here, going from pre-cachexia through to cachexia and then refractory cachexia. And I've just pulled out the definitions here. So if we start with pre-cachexia, that is represented by weight loss of 5% or less, anorexia and some metabolic change. Now, if we think about weight loss of 5%, that is actually quite a small amount of weight. So in a 70 kilo person, 5% body weight loss is about 3.5 kilos. It's about half a stone. And actually, I see a lot of people who early on in their illness lose a few pounds, lose 5 or 6 pounds, and don't really think anything of it. Sometimes it's before they're diagnosed. Some people might be quite glad that they've lost some weight, so to lose half a stone, they're not particularly worried about. But that can be an indication of pre-cachexia. Cachexia itself is represented by weight loss of more than 5% or a BMI of less than 20. So again, using the 70 kilo definition, 7 kilos in a 70 kilo individual would represent 10% of their body weight being lost. And in refractory cachexia, that's when you see that severe weight loss that I indicated on the photograph in the slide previously. And this is at the advanced stage of disease, where the disease is pro-catabolic, so there's lots of breakdown going on, and often the disease is non-responsive to anti-cancer treatment. So this is thinking about cachexia in cancer. Here, people have usually got quite a short prognosis, and the major difficulty with refractory cachexia is that it can't be reversed. And how do we identify cachexia? Well, unfortunately, it's not that easy to identify. It's not easy to say there's this one biochemical marker, and if that is raised or lowered, that means somebody has got cachexia. CRP, C-reactive protein, is often raised in cachexia, but CRP can be raised for lots of different reasons. So it is that there isn't one easy marker. We're generally using it, we're looking at the patient's clinical characteristics and their circumstances. And certainly I will have people referred to me who are very thin, who have poor appetite, where you can see that muscle wasting has occurred. And then we would all be quite clear in saying that that person does have cachexia or refractory cachexia. I think it's much, much more difficult to identify cachexia at the earlier stage of an illness, at that pre-cachectic stage. And I think that's difficult because if we can identify cachexia earlier, we may be able to support people a little bit earlier with their eating and drinking. But we have to work with what we've got. And when I talk about the psychosocial impact, I think listening to patients and thinking about what they're saying to us about their weight change is going to be very significant. Why should we be concerned about this problem of cachexia? Well, anorexia, which you'll remember is one part of cachexia, is often ranked as one of the 5 most challenging problems that patients face. Poor appetite and weight loss can rank 5th and 6th in prevalence of symptoms, according to this study by Tenusen et al. And anorexia is associated with poor quality of life. We will often see, we talked about iPods, using iPods the last time, and often when you're using iPods, poor appetite, weight loss, lack of energy will often be identified as one of the 3 main problems that people see. And obviously people can score for poor appetite in the iPod score. So I think when we're looking at our own clinical practice, we can see that weight loss and everything associated with weight loss can have quite a significant impact on people, both physically and when we're thinking about the psychological and psychosocial impact of weight loss. Just as a reminder, we did talk the last time about other factors that might affect food intake. So along with the impact of the disease, we will also think about the physical factors and the psychological factors that may affect somebody's food intake. So if we just have a quick recap, any of those symptoms that might be affecting the GI tract, constipation, nausea and vomiting, sore mouth, for example, all of those things can affect people's food intake. And psychological factors around anxiety, to depression, existential and spiritual distress, worrying about family, worrying about the future, they can also affect people's food intake. That's another reason why it can be difficult to unpick what's actually causing weight loss for people with cancer and other diseases. So remembering that anorexia is one of the is part of the syndrome of cachexia. Anorexia is influenced by both physiological and psychological factors. Now, this is when I will say I am not a biochemistry expert, and complete textbooks are written around the biochemistry of anorexia. So I'm just pulling out some key important facts that I think it's useful for us to know. So anorexia is caused by tumour cells that produce cytokines, and I've listed some of those cytokines there: TNF, interleukin 1 and 6, and interferon gamma. And these cytokines may directly affect the appetite. And I think it's important to know that, because when I'm working with patients, I think to help people understand that it's something happening in their body that is causing their appetite to be poor, I think can be very, very useful for people to have that knowledge. These cytokines cause alterations in how the body metabolizes carbohydrate, protein, and fat. So that includes glucose intolerance, it includes resistance to insulin, increased lipolysis, so that's increased breakdown of fat, and increased skeletal muscle catabolism, again, breakdown. And as I say, I just think it's important to know that, because I'm sure many of you will have experienced this. Patients and their families can feel very distressed about weight loss and often feel that the weight loss is somehow their fault. They're not trying hard enough to eat. They're not eating the right things. So I think to be able to put it in the context that actually this is what is happening in your body and this can't be prevented, as I say, I think that that can be useful for people to know and understand. But treating anorexia in cachexia is difficult. Some single agents may help improve appetite. So we may often use steroids, dexamethasone we use quite commonly to help. One of the things it can do is help stimulate the appetite. And some people do find that that works quite effectively for them. Obviously, we need to be careful about how long people are on steroids and the dosing. And we often, we wouldn't necessarily want people to be on steroids for protracted periods of time. But some people do find that steroids do improve their appetite, sometimes for a short time. Some patients I see tried dexamethasone and it doesn't make any difference to them. But I think it's definitely one thing that is worth trying. But as I've already said, the poor appetite is only one element of the cachexia. So our success in reversing the weight loss can be limited. So this all sounds a bit negative, and I don't want to sound negative really, but I think it's important just to think about the context. And just some other interventions that people have looked at, some interventions that might inhibit the inflammatory cytokines and agents to influence protein metabolism, so the build-up of protein rather than the breakdown of protein. But there have not really been, there isn't a lot of strong evidence to demonstrate really good efficacy. So cachexia and anorexia in cachexia is difficult to treat. And why is it important? Well, what is the impact of cachexia? So thinking about the physical impact of cachexia, that loss of muscle mass and weight that is not usually reversible will have an impact on strength, and that has an impact on function. So that is often what people say to me. I feel very weak, I'm losing all my muscles and I can't do the things that I want to be able to do. So that's one of the physical impacts. And we can estimate the effect on physical function. There's various methods of doing it, and they're listed there in order. We will often use the Karnofsky score, and hopefully some people will be familiar with that. So the Karnofsky score is when it goes from 0 to 100%, and we will often use the Karnofsky score to kind of put where somebody is as far as their activity is concerned, and then we can go back to that and review the Karnofsky score. We might also use objective measures. So, for example, my physiotherapy colleagues will use things like a 2-minute walk test or a 1-minute walk test, depending on somebody's ability, to see how far somebody can walk in a defined period of time, and then use that as a serial measure to see what might be changing as far as somebody's physical function is concerned. There is some evidence that says that exercise might attenuate the effects of cachexia by improving muscle metabolism, insulin sensitivity, and the levels of inflammation. So there is some good evidence about exercising in cachexia, but exercise tolerance for people with cachexia can be poor. So you do have to think carefully about what kind of exercise programs people are doing. And maybe consider it as an early intervention with low intensity exercise. So at my hospice, and I'm sure at many of yours, we do have rehab gym work for people with all, across the spectrum of diseases. And we'll encourage people, if they're able to come to do some rehab, some gym work, people can find that a really, really positive thing to do. I think that's a physical thing and a psychological thing as well. The psychosocial impact of weight loss in cachexia, I think, is huge. And it's something that I am particularly interested in, and I will just share with you some research that I have done quite recently. But you will see that weight loss doesn't just have a physical impact, it has a major psychosocial consequence that may impact on someone's quality of life. And those psychosocial effects are defined as negative emotions that are associated with things like reduced dietary intake, that involuntary weight loss, and the social consequences of those symptoms. And those negative emotions include a range of things, but sadness, disappointment, bewilderment, anger, frustration, existential distress. And I'm sure that you see this as often as I do. Anorexia, as part of cachexia, has an important emotional significance because food and eating, it's kind of obvious to say it, but food and eating are essential for life and for survival. So when people can't eat and have got a very poor appetite, people very quickly see that in the context of a deterioration. And, you know, people will often say to me, if my relative can't eat, they will die. So people do see those things wrapped up very, very tightly together. I think what's also important is that preparation of and serving of food, it's about more than just nutrition. It's about much more than nutrition. It's about how we show that we love each other, we care for each other. It's central to our everyday activity. So it has powerful social, emotional and cultural meanings that aren't just to do with the actual nutrition, but are to do with the act of sharing food and sharing, showing each other that we care for each other. So think about how we use food. So yeah, we know that we need food for nutrition. We know that we need the vitamins and minerals and energy and protein. But actually, we're doing a lot more with eating and drinking. So just a few ways here. Think about celebrations. All of our celebrations, many of our celebrations are around food, be that eating special food or different food, or it might be fasting. So the kind of opposite side of it, but it's still about the food. How it's very prevalent in how we socialise. I put that little picture down the bottom of afternoon tea. We try to have an afternoon tea at the hospice so that patients and their families have got an opportunity to sit together and have just a little bit of something nice to eat and to eat it together, because actually eating together is a very, very important part of our daily lives. And sometimes that gets lost, I think, in institutional settings, if you like, where people are eating by their bed or in their bed. I think having the opportunity to eat with other people is really, really powerful. So we're thinking about nurture, we're thinking about love, socialising, sharing, normality. Being able to eat and drink is very much part of what we do in our normal everyday lives. And when that is taken away from you or is made very difficult for you because your appetite is really poor, or because you feel sick, or because you feel depressed and anxious, then that can have really, really powerful effects on the individual and within their family and their caring network. So last year, when I was as part of my MSc, my research project was around the psychosocial support that health professionals provide to patients who experience weight loss. So what I was trying to find out is, what did patients feel healthcare professionals could provide for them when they were experiencing weight loss in advanced cancer? And my aims were to describe the experience of weight loss in people with advanced cancer and to explore what psychosocial support patients felt that healthcare professionals can give, and to develop recommendations for clinical practice. This was, as a dietitian, I talk to people about eating and drinking every day. But this actually gave me an opportunity to talk to people not as a dietitian, to talk to people as a researcher and to really explore with them what their experience was, which I found very, very revealing. I did semi-structured qualitative interviews with patients who had advanced cancer, who had expressed distress around weight loss. So the distress was picked up through their IPOS score, or sometimes other clinicians picked it up when they were doing assessments with people. People would often just talk about how difficult they found it now that they couldn't eat and drink in the same way as they had done previously. And I recorded all the interviews and then did a thematic content analysis of the interviews. I had 9 people in my study. There were 13 referred to the study, but the 4 people were either 3 of the people were too ill or died before I could do their interview, and 1 person declined. But I interviewed 9 people, so a small study. But I think some of the information that you get from these qualitative studies can be very, very useful and powerful. Patients, the people on the study clearly described to me the physical impact that the weight loss had on them. So they described the physical impact, which linked very strongly with psychosocial impact. Being unable to function normally for the participants had a significant impact on their quality of life, how they viewed themselves, and how others viewed them. And I just want to give you a few quotes of what people said to me, because I think if we remember how people feel about weight loss, it will help us when we are trying and helping to look after people who are experiencing weight loss. So this woman was 56 with a GU cancer, and she said to me, something funny happened. My daughter made me laugh, and I'm like, a belly laugh, you know, a really good laugh. I had to sit down. That just wore me out, just having that laugh. It was ridiculous. So she was really describing the impact that that lack of energy had on her. Something so simple as having a conversation and a good laugh exhausted her because she was so lacking in energy. And she described the frustration and sadness that evokes for her. And that lack of energy often affected how people were able to manage their everyday lives, and meant that they had to rearrange their everyday lives. So simple things like now having to live in the downstairs of their house because they can no longer use the stairs. So these are things that can have a really powerful impact on people. Participants also talked about how the weight loss had altered the view of their identity, so both physically and emotionally. And people often use the term skin and bones. So people often said to me, they're just skin and bones. And there's this man, so this was a 52-year-old man. Sorry. So he said to me, I've never been big boned, I've always been slight, but I've always been able to lift my body weight. He had been a builder, and he showed me how he would pick up great big sacks of cement and throw them over his shoulder. And he said, I've always had a bit of muscle. I've got none. I've got hardly any muscle. I've got hardly any flesh. I'm literally skin and bone. And I found that quite a profound thing. This man was quite slight, and he had lost about 15 kilos in the preceding 6 months or so. And I think that, if I recall, it represented about 30% of his body weight. So he had lost a really significant amount of weight. And people often described how they felt they were wasting away. So this lady said to me, it's at that point when the weight goes down and down and down, and you know what you already look like, and then you think, oh my gosh, you know, what's wrong with me? It's not going, she said, it's not going to be my problem. I'm just going to waste away. So people can see what's happening to them. Their families, carers can see what's happening to them. And that has a profound effect on people. And this lady said to me, but then, I mean, obviously, I know you have to eat to survive. And it's a worry, you know, I mean, that you're losing weight all the time. So people are very, very aware of the weight loss, and they often internalized their distress at the weight loss. People often said to me, I haven't talked about it with my family, or I try not to get undressed in front of my family because I don't want them to see how much weight I've lost. Or one lady said to me that she went to try on some new clothes, and one of her family members took her, and she said, I saw her in the mirror, I saw her look at how thin I was. And they both just kind of looked away and tried to avoid having to talk about it. So you can see that there's really profound psychosocial impact on that weight loss. And people described to me that they had been weighed throughout their illness, but that often they felt it was a tick box exercise. So often when we see people in hospices, we're seeing people towards the end of their illness. People will have been through all sorts of treatment. If they're having palliative or any kind of chemotherapy, for example, people will be weighed routinely. People are weighed so that they can do the dosing for the chemo, for example. And people often found that the weight was just being jotted down and then it was kind of being taken away, that a discussion was not had about what had happened to their weight. So the weight would be creeping down. This man here described how he'd lost 10 kilos and nobody had said anything about it. And this was quite prevalent across all of the people I spoke to, and it kind of surprised me and shocked me really, because if people are losing weight, to me, that is an opening, that's an opportunity to start talking to people about what might be concerning them. But I think that there is something about the fact that we know it's very difficult to treat cachexia. We know it's difficult to reverse that weight. And there is something called the weight loss taboo, which is described in healthcare professionals. So healthcare professionals can see that somebody's losing weight, but haven't really got any solutions to it. So rather than acknowledge it, people just don't say anything about it. And in my study and in other research, patients can feel very lonely and isolated when that happens, because they're very conscious of the fact that this is happening to them, but nobody is saying anything about it. Also, they might have quite short time to have a consultation with their doctor or whoever they're seeing, and things like pain or nausea or other symptoms might come higher up in the list of what's important to talk about, and weight loss often drops off the bottom. So I think it's really important that we give people the opportunity to identify that weight and weight loss is important to them. And if there was one thing that came out for me of my research, is the importance of listening to people and responding even when we might not be able to provide them with a solution. So I will often see people who have got refractory cachexia, and I know, and I will talk to people and explain to people that actually we will be very, very difficult to prevent this weight loss from happening. But giving that opportunity to have it out there in the open, to talk about the difficulties that that is causing for the individual, I think is very important. I will often work with families to work out what their concerns are and actually try to allay some of their concerns. So just being able to explain to people, excuse me, that they are losing weight because of their cancer or because of their disease can be quite helpful, rather than, as I said earlier, for people to think that my relative is not trying hard enough to eat, or I'm not providing the right food for my relative, or as the ill person, I'm not trying hard enough. I must make myself eat, even if that leads to negative symptoms like feeling sick or having diarrhea. So this is where the balance of very small amounts of very tasty, nourishing food against, trying to encourage people to eat large meals. I mean, what I will often be talking about, and we'll look at this further in the final webinar, is simple ways of making food nourishing, tasty, appealing, but also accepting that when that person feels that they've eaten enough, then it's okay to stop. It's okay for the person to stop, and it's okay for their family to see them stop. And if that means a very, very small meal, a few spoonfuls, I think psychologically that's better than not having anything at all for some people. But keep on prompting and kind of forcing and nagging people to eat can be quite distressing. So in summary, as I hope I've shown, cachexia has a range of physical and psychological consequences. Patients and their families are concerned about weight loss. And as healthcare professionals and people working with people experiencing cachexia, I feel that we do need to open up opportunities for people to talk about weight loss. Even if the weight loss can't be prevented or reversed, patients and their families are often reassured when they understand what is happening to them and why. And if there's one thing that I have learned from doing my research, as a dietitian, you would think it would be quite easy for me to talk about weight loss, but I would sometimes hover around the edges and not want to really say to people it's because of your disease. And actually, I feel very able now to say, you have this syndrome, it's called cachexia, we forget about the name at that point, but one of the things that happens is your body is producing certain chemicals that make it very difficult for you to, for your metabolism, and that your metabolism is working differently to how it normally will, and that's why you're losing weight and you're losing your muscle. And it's not because you're not doing the right thing, it's because of the disease, it's because of what's happening to you. And I feel and find that people respond quite positively to that. And I will then work with people to try and find out what's the most important thing for them with their eating and drinking. Is it that sitting down with other people? Is it that just having a little taste of something that you enjoy? What's important to that person with their eating and drinking? And then we can work together, not necessarily to find a really great solution that means that they gain weight, but actually to help get to a point where they feel that their quality of life is as good as it can be around the very difficult area of anorexia and cachexia. So there's some references there, and just a little bit ahead of time I can finish.